Dear students, dear guests, welcome to our joint seminar, Global Challenges to Development. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany, the State University of Maringá in Brazil, and the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. In this course, we will alternate theoretical debates with students' projects related to sustainability, education, creative industries, geopolitical instabilities, poverty and hunger alleviation, and health. We will have guests from different countries and contexts who will contribute with lecturers to these topics. In both universities, the course is offered to students of different disciplines, in Tübingen as part of the Global Awareness Education in the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and at the State University of Maringá as a free extension course. The course organizers are Professor Mauricio Reinhardt and Professor Sarah Pichет, State University of Maringá, Professor Ronnie Nakwadi, Nelson Mandela University, and me, Dr. Glaucia Perez da Silva, University of Tübingen. So today, we will hear a lecture on the Latin American paradigm of urban studies, the question of underdevelopment, and the production of knowledge about the Global South, challenges of internal and external decolonization, with Professor Javier Ruiz-Tagle from Chile. So now I will invite my colleague, Sarah Pichet, to introduce our guest.
So Javier Ruiz-Tagle is Associate Professor in Institute of Urban and Territorial Studies at the Pontífica Universidad Católica in Chile. He's also Associate Researcher at the Center of Sustainable Urban Development, Adjunt Researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies, Project Marginality in Emblematic Poblaciones, and Director of Certificate Degree on Housing, UC. Welcome and thank you, Professor Javier. The word is yours.
Thank you very much. As I said, it's a pleasure to me to have this special mixture of students from many parts of the world, people from the Global South, people from Latin America, people from Africa, hopefully, or at least at other sessions, but it is very interesting to meet people from different sites, and also if you are interested, is to learn that you are interested in theories coming from different parts of the world. We've been discussing this type of thing, the thing that I'm going to present today, from the last 50 years. Within Latin Americans, some of those discussions have arrived to Europe, but now that we have a more globalized world, we can connect to each other more easily, and have these theories fly and travel more easily, and discuss it more easily than before. Also, as you may know, this is more and more information. Before 50 years ago, we didn't have that much level of knowledge, that much level of the amount of papers and books that we have right now. But this is something, I mean, there are core ideas that I want to show you today, which are part of the big discussions in Latin America. And I hope they can illuminate some of the discussions you have in this course about development in general. So I will start sharing my screen. I'm sorry for the large title. It's kind of very long. If you want to interrupt me, I'm happy to that. I'm happy to answer questions and comments. I love comments instead of questions, and it's easier for us when we are presenting something on Zoom and we don't really know if there is people on the other side. If we have some proof of life by the other side with a question, with a comment, that's much better. If not, I'm happy to answer all the questions at the end. That's fine anyway. So this is a long title. We call it like this paradigm of urban studies. Why is a paradigm? Because this is it's a collection of theories that we created as Latin Americans. The problems, one of the big problems of of Global South knowledge in general, I would say, is that we are always working with Global North theories. And that's a problem of development as well, because the issue of development came from the North to be implemented in the South. But we don't thought about development in the first place. And the same with these theories, right? So we are used to receive theories from the North, but there was a point in time in which we created, as Latin Americans, a big set of theories. That's why we call it, and we're speaking right now of a paradigm of urban studies from Latin America, with concepts created and crafted and discussed from Latin. So of course the question of development and underdevelopment was part of that paradigm. But also I'm gonna mix this with a discussion about the creation of knowledge about the Global South, because there is a new wave of post-colonial knowledge production from the last decades or the last 15 years in the urban studies field, in many fields, but in the urban studies field as well. And that knowledge is interesting. We receive it well. It's mostly created from South Africa, India, mostly those places, and also rearranged and coordinated from the UK. And that's part of the thing that I'm going to show you. And I will try to show this in terms of internal and external efforts of decolonization of our creation of knowledge. This is not something I don't want to send you the message that some type of knowledge is better than the other. I'm just posing the question so you can think about it. So which one is more maybe legitimate, which one is maybe more appropriate, which one is maybe more pertinent, etc. That's part of the questions that I'm going to pose here. We're going to revise first this so-called Latin American paradigm. We're going to revise some issues of informality and marginality in Latin America, which are part of the main urban problems that we have been studying in the last 50 years. Some particularities and new topics from the last 20 years that we have been discussing in our urban studies debates in the continent. And then I'm gonna shift to this whole discussion about the Global South and the new theories, the new urban theories that are coming from this post-colonial approach, and then trying to pose some problems of those theories. Not very absolutely critical, but some problems in which they are establishing right now. In the worldwide discussions of urban studies, the post-colonial approach is becoming very, very big and very, very powerful in some sense. So it is important for us as Latin Americans to see and to discuss this new approach, this new paradigm of post-colonial studies, and see how it can reveal, how it can help in our own debates about urban studies. This Latin American paradigm. We start this Latin American paradigm as a post-positivist stage. So this started in the 60s, 70s, with, of course, some influence from Europe, because we had a lot of scholars studying in Europe and then coming back to Latin America and then trying to create and discuss some local knowledge, but in a post-positivist stage, in some decades that were so important for the development of critical studies in Latin America. Marxism was there, left-wing governments were there, revolutions were there. May 68 was in France, the civil rights movement was in the US, etc. So there was a particular point of time in which theories were arising in several parts of the world. There was a commitment to transformation from several scholars, but there was a context of few bridges between academia and activism. So people wanted to build those bridges, wanted to go to the popular neighborhoods, to go to with the popular classes and the guilds. I mean, the social organizations, etc. And so there was, of course, a context about less exportation and more importation of foreign theories. We have been living in that problem and in that discussion for our whole intellectual history, which I would say started from the arrival of the Spanish Empire to Latin America. So in a context of accelerated urbanization, Latin America is the most urbanized country, I mean, the most urbanized continent in the world. It's about 84% urban, and the rest is rural, compared to other continents or North America, Europe, Africa. There was also economic backwardness and social inequality in those times, and I mean in the 50s and the 60s, which promoted a great growth in research in urban studies, with theories on imperialism, on colonial dependency, on what they call dependent urbanization, on uneven development, on urban marginality, on collective consumption units, etc. We had also not just Latin American scholars going to train to Europe, but also some Europeans coming to Latin America. For example, Manuel Castells, who is a French-Spanish scholar, Marxist at that time, he came to our institute in the 70s, brought by the students actually, as a critical scholar, brought to Chile, and he was creating incentives for, in many ways, to do this and this type of research, to create our own theories, to create discussions that were more appropriate to this continent. So this Latin America's urbanization was really particular and really very, very different to what happened in the United States, Canada, and in Europe. Why? We have this very fast rural-urban migration, people coming from the countryside. We have an early metropolization with a disjointed urban network. So we had big, huge cities without much order. We had a dissociation between this urbanization and industrialization. And I will show you this with a figure. Why that happened, I'm going to show you, but basically we had millions of people coming from the countryside, but instead of being employed in industries, in factories, as it happened in the US and in Europe, people were employed in informality. So most of our jobs are informal jobs, and I'm talking about the continent in general, and those jobs and that life was precarious. So cities were marked by this residential segregation and socio-spatial inequalities, because we had in most cities and in most countries a small elite, a small upper income groups, and then a vast majority of precariousness, informality, etc. And of course, also lack of planning. So this happened very, very fast in 20, 30 years, 3 decades. And it was a big problem for the state, not having all the tools for ordering cities, and for creating jobs and for receiving this countryside population. So it was a big problem in those times, 50s, 60s, etc. So here I'm showing like a very, very simplistic schematic about the difference between the industrialization of the US or North America and European cities and Latin American cities. There were, of course, different years. It started earlier in Europe and in the US. It started later in Latin America. But as you see, the most important thing was, and I'm going to show you, I hope you can see my pointer. Can you see this pointer? All right. This line is about the population growth. it grew very similarly in both places. This is countryside to city migration. This is a worldwide phenomenon called urbanization, basically. And it is happening right now in Africa and in Asia very, very fast in this very moment. But the big difference was the amount of industrial jobs in both sides of the global south, global north divide. So the peak of industrial jobs in Europe and in the US was about 2/3 of the working population. In Latin America, the peak of the most industrialized countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico was around 30% at the most. Some other countries didn't even reach 10%. And so the majority of those jobs were not complementary of the industrial jobs. They were the majority of what people do for a living, informal jobs. So it was called by different names, this phenomenon. Some scholars started to call it marginality because there were people on the margins of society. They were not received economically, residentially, and as a human being. Others were calling with Marxist terms as a marginal mass, for example, or as an industrial reserve army. The idea of an industrial reserve army in Marxist terms means that you are used as a labor force just in times of economic expansion. For the rest of the time, you're just outside of the system. So we're different approaches trying to describe this phenomenon, which was very Latin American, and also it illuminated discussions in other parts of the global south, Africa and Asia, why we are different from Europe and from the United States as a society. This is the big difference. They are industrialized society on one side, and they are marginal, informal societies with a very small elites on the other side. The thing is that industrial jobs and industrial society have a lot of economic growth, but societies based on informal jobs, that economic growth is almost non-existent because those jobs are very low-paying jobs, very low productivity. So societies cannot advance in those terms. And of course, the state doesn't even receive any taxes because most informal jobs don't pay any taxes, right? So if the state doesn't have money from taxes, the state cannot improve quality of life, cannot improve productivity, and that becomes like a vicious cycle of development and underdevelopment, which is part of the issue of this course, right? So this Latin American paradigm was a debate between some type of different types of militant researchers. Some of them have influences from the Chicago School, and here I'm meaning the Chicago School of Sociology, which was the beginning of sociology in the 1900s, at the beginning, in Chicago especially, and in the US generally. But on the other side, we have the influence of French Marxist sociology, people coming from France, people with Marxist approaches, and of course there were opposing positions in ideological terms, but it becomes a little bit mixed and applied. They started to apply all of this knowledge to Latin America, but in some sense we can say that there was intellectual colonialism from the right and from the left. From the right receiving people from ideas from the Chicago School, and from the left receiving people and ideas from the French Marxist urban sociology school. So this French urban sociology was emphasizing the political economy of urbanization, the role of the city in the accumulation of capital and social reproduction. Cities as understood from Frederick Engels and even before him as the places of social reproduction. Economic production is done on factories, right? That's in which you invest capital, you put labor, and you get surplus value, right? But all that happens outside factories is social reproduction. The way you go home, the way you take a bus, what happens inside your house, how you sleep, how you recreate with your family, how you eat, and all of that is done by women. Actually, that's the big issue about feminist urban studies, is about social reproduction, right? So to bring a worker for the next day, having slept, having eaten, having recreated, you need the whole city. You need the city, you need parks, you need restaurants, you need houses, you need healthcare, you need kitchens, you need a house, etc. And most of that job is done by women. So they were emphasizing that part of understanding of cities as a key part of production. You need this social reproduction, and this social reproduction happens in city and mostly happens at home, in housing. So, and they were also focusing on urban policies in the capitalist land production, the production of land, the production of the built environment as an essential part of capitalism. Actually, they were also focusing on urban social movements, and also because it is very important, they were focusing on informality, trying to understand how informality is the big force of our country. So they started creating this idea of dependent urbanization theory. They were all talking about dependency theory, of how, as Latin American economies, we are dependent of why they produce on the global north, or what special products are key to our production. So in terms of urbanization, they were basing their influence on guys like Manuel Castells, but also Latin American guys like Aníbal Quijano, Fernando Cardoso from Brazil, Paul Singer from Brazil as well. And Chile was kind of a meeting point, because most of these international agencies in which people were debating this idea were located in Chile before our military coup d'etat in 1973. So the Economic Commission of Latin American Caribbean Studies was, and it still is in Santiago, Flaxo, our own institute. So we were receiving most of these debates and trying to spread it in the continent. So where this dependent urbanization theory was emphasizing dependent industrialization, and how this dependent industrialization was not absorbing rural workers for their factories, which forced excessive agglomeration. That's the big irony of our urbanization. We were receiving millions of people, but with no jobs, as opposed to what happened in the US and in Europe. They received millions of people, but the big majority of them, they were employed in the industries and the factories, but we had not factories here. I mean, we had just a few of them, and they were not, most of the people were not employed of them. So issues of informality and marginality in Latin America, which is the second topic of this. You can interrupt me, as I said, or comment something. I'll be happy to answer that. So in Latin America, we call about this Latin American paradigm, which was trying to collect ideas and build knowledge to understand how is informality built, how does informality produced and reproduced in cities, and this happened mostly between 1970 and 1990. And the current post-colonial literature actually doesn't highlight it, but we created a lot of knowledge in those decades, knowledge which was written in Spanish, of course, and that's part of the barriers, and I'm going to talk about that. But it was a big amount of knowledge, and this was the creation of our own paradigm, which also influenced discussions in other parts of the world, discussions in Africa and discussions in Asia from some scholars, and I would say like It had a big influence, but it had some influence. So I will show you first what were the positivist approaches to informality. So they were first the first scholars that were in front of this big arrival countryside migrants to cities, and they were building more and more informal houses. First of all, they were all shocked with this. They were describing the issue. They were trying to quantify the amount of informal housing, trying to find solutions. So they passed from an initial surprise to a rejection. They didn't like what was happening in cities. There were demands for eradication, actually, from many public officials. And they were saying, these guys are doing land squatting in cities. We need this land clear for formal urban development. But then that transformed into resignation and to institutionalization of informality. So it was like a two-sided politics. First, at the first time, they were thinking about the replacement of informal housing units by planned housing, modern housing developments. But then there was a second stage in where people started to recognize and to regularize informal developments of housing. And in this part, it was very important, the ideas about self-construction. So people were talking about property and self-help and self-construction. And here again, we have the influences of foreigners. We have a special British architect and anarchist called John Turner, who came to work especially in the barriadas, the informal settlements of Lima in Peru. And he was like celebrating the idea of self-construction in an anarchist way. Why? Because he was thinking, these people are not going to wait 50 years for the state to have a house. These people are building their own dreams, their own lives. So he was envisioning an anarchist idea of building an autonomy, of the self-capacities of people of building something. So he was celebrating this, and he collided, and in some sense, in a very strange, and this was described by Mike Davis, who just happened to die, as the most strange intellectual marriage of the 20th century between this British anarchist architect on the left side and Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank, on the right side. Right, Robert McNamara was thinking about the efficiency of public spending. So the idea of spending less and benefiting more people, which is part of most of our politics, our policies in Latin America and the global South are about that, about how efficient is your spending. So McNamara said that, well, if John Turner, this anarchist, is celebrating informality, is celebrating self-construction, why don't we get the idea of giving people just the land and the title, the property title, and leave them to self-construct their own houses? So we can spend just a few amount of money and benefit millions more. So that became the most popular policy in the global South from the 60s and 70s, and not just in Latin America, in Africa and in Asia. And it was called Sites and Services, lotes con servicios. It had different names in different countries, but it was based basically on the delivery of a piece of land and a land title and the services of electricity, water, and sewage. And then people had to self-construct their own house. So that was the mixture, the marriage, the intellectual marriage between John Turner, the British architect, and Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank. So that changed the UN policy with these theories and ideas about power and individual freedom. So this these assumptions from the positivist side of the study of informality. They were thinking that residents were excluded from modernity. Informality was described as a common phenomenon in Latin America. It represents the invasion of rural poverty. It breaks the utopia of the rational city and shows also the inability of the state of building a developed country, a developed city. So that was, again, the issue of development and underdevelopment, and informality in the middle. Why informality is blocking the advance, the progress of development, or is not, right? So there was a big discussion of that. On the side of post-positivist approaches, there were knowledge creation about transformation-oriented with a predominance of structuralist theories, with Marxism and functionalism on that side. So they were understanding the idea of marginality as a generic name for informal settlements under residents. The idea of being marginal was the idea of being excluded from the benefits of modernization. So on the conservative side, the idea of marginality came from the influence of some sociologists. Again, some people, in this case, was a guy from Belgium coming to a university in Chile, who started to develop some of these ideas, some conservative ideas of marginality, who was linked to the action of the Christian Democratic Party. As you have in Germany, the Christian Democratic Party here is also important. So they were proposing ideas of popular promotion and posing the idea of marginality as lack of participation in the modernization of the state and in development in general, in the idea of development. It was also Gino Germani in Argentina. Gino Germani is like Argentina's Durkheim. Emil Durkheim, you know, is the big sociologist from France, who is the equivalent of Adam Smith in economics, is the right wing of sociology. So Gino Germani was our Latin America's Durkheim. And he started to think about marginality and modernization with some influence from the Chicago School, and trying to pose the idea of marginality as cultural backwardness of immigrants, of rural immigrants bringing their rural life to cities and building their informal life in cities. But on the left side, again, I'm shifting sides from time to time. So on the left side, we have this structural dependency theory with groups of authors and scholars linked to this international agency like the Economic Commission of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, in which they understood Latin American underdevelopment as linked to a colonial past and as a deterioration of the terms of trade with development countries. So they proposed the idea of the IC policy. IC is ISI, which means import substitution industrialization. They promoted the idea of our own type of industrialization, not in all dimensions of industrialization, but focused on some particular products that we should not be importing from other countries, but we should be able to produce ourselves. So like sinks for bathrooms. Why do we have to import sinks instead of just producing our own sinks? Like very, very basic products. So they understood marginality as a non-incorporation into the modernization of capitalism. So it was kind of a critical view, but within capitalism. And then came this also from the left, but more on the left, this Marxist dependency theory with influence from Manuel Castells as well, in which they were emphasizing this expansion of capitalism and imperialism, connecting dependency with marginality. focusing on popular settlements organization, so the grassroots organization of these informal settlements and their revolutionary potential. Actually, this great book from Manuel Castells, The City and the Grassroots, was based on many urban social movements around the world, but in the case of Chile, it was focused on the popular movements from this this land squatting, who were very, very politicized, especially in times of President Salvador Allende, before the coup d'etat. So in these production relations in informal settlements, they focus on the identification of the agents of the productions of informality, the generation and the appropriation of rents, even in the informal rents within informal settlements, the conflicts of interest, the state actions, and all of this with influence from French Marxist sociology. And then I'm going to show you, I'm going to go further forward like 2 more decades and show you problems that we have had as a continent from the 1990s, 2000, 2010, and not about the origins of our informal cities, or not so formal cities as we sometimes call. So new research topics and current particularities that I'm going to show you. Some distinct aspects of Latin America that we have now in cities, as we can characterize Latin American cities. We have an indigenous persistence, and actually we have been from the 2000 a lot of emergence of multicultural social movements, especially in countries like Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, but many other countries are starting to count their people, their indigenous people, on census, to put more policies and more multicultural policies in different parts of different dimensions in society. So it is a very important issue, and it's becoming much more important. We also have an accelerated urbanization with late industrialization, as I mentioned before. So a lot of people coming to cities, but not employing in industries until very lately. We have an early deindustrialization as well. So we industrialized a little bit our societies, but very, very soon we deindustrialized them, and then we follow the steps of the neoliberal reforms as happen around the world. We also have this informal tertiarization. So there are tertiary jobs, service jobs that are done in an informal way. We have massive self-construction that is still a reality. It happens in the 50s and 60s, but it's still happening now. We have informal land and housing markets. So a lot of houses are sold and are rented in an informal way, in an informal market. We have a structural unemployment and poverty. We have urban violence. Latin America is, by some statistics, is the most violent continent in the world. Of course, with a lot of difference in different cities, but it's one of the most violent countries in the world. So these global theorizations of cities and urban models coming from the US and coming from Europe are not very valid for the Latin American reality. This is the issue that I want to pose here. We have different cities, we have different societies, and we need to understand them with different theories and different models and constructions of knowledge. We also can have mutations, as some authors say, of urbanization. We have an almost complete urbanization of our countries. Like 84% of the population in Latin America live in cities, which is the highest rate around the world. We have these countryside migrations and international migrations within Latin America that are accelerating the metropolization and the development of city regions, of huge cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Lima, and other cities. We have also strong changes in the territorial distribution, with social housing in the farthest periphery, with emptying centers, like centers being emptied, people abandoning the center of cities, and also tertiary corridors of informal service jobs. And also we have the issue of land rents with formal and informal markets coexisting with different rules, with different institutions. We also have a privatization of public space because of the issue of urban violence, of course. Changes in land use due to this deindustrialization that I mentioned, and the verticalization of cities due to this real estate financial capital, as it is happening around the world, but it's much more intense in Latin America because of deregulation, because of the attraction of international investments, etc. We also have problems of commodification and privatization of the urban, with all the elements of the urban structure being privatized and commoditized, and with little defense capacity of citizens. So we have these big powers of international investors, big powers of national governments, and citizens are in the middle. They cannot defend themselves through like institutional channels for defend their own neighborhoods, for example. We have also this issue, as I mentioned, of deindustrialization, of informal tertiarization, like service jobs done in an informal way, in which this deindustrialization is very closely linked to the informal, where with industrial employment, which was very, very little, it disappeared, and productivity and industrial wages were on the fall, and urban wages were on the fall. So we have been societies that are less and less productive, more dependent on foreign investment and on extractivist activities, and so cities have become more vulnerable to these international movements of capital. So in terms of urban social movements, they were relatively weakened in their historical claims due to the impacts in the role of the state. The state has become weaker in many senses, but also in terms of political clientelism. So there is a lot of corruption, there's a lot of clientelist relationship within especially local governments and local organizations in terms of exchanging favors for votes, which is a very Latin American phenomenon, and also new housing policies promoting the co-optation of social organization or grassroots organization, and demobilizing practices from NGO, but also new demands appear, such as the right to the city and the right to housing, and this is very strong in countries as Brazil, in which they have the Estatuto da Cidade, which is very influenced by the ideas of the right to the city by Henri Lefebvre, a French Marxist, urban philosopher. Again, some foreign influences, but it has become a big influence for social movements. These ideas of right to the city, right to housing, etc. And also we have these problems of violence and daily life. Latin American cities are increasingly more violent since the 1980s. In particularly in Chile, we thought that we were like an island of non-violence in Latin America, but we have become more and more violent, and we have more and more crime in the last 5 years. So it is a Latin American issue in most of the countries. There are new research agendas in terms of research, in terms of investigation. We had, of course, the crisis of Marxism in the 1980s, in which we passed from this idea of Fordism to neoliberalism. So Marxism was not accounting for those transformations. We have a diversification of themes, topics, and theoretical orientations from the 1990s, 2000, as it has happened in many disciplines of the social sciences, but also the political economy of urbanization is still relevant, and we have some new theories on globalization and urban restructuring, but we have, as it happens in most places of the world, less social involvement of researchers, of scholars. In the 60s and 70s, we have scholars going to poor neighborhoods, talking and very involved with grassroots organizations, but now scholars are focused on their papers and their Web of Science papers and on their impact and on the metrics that universities pose on them. And we know that pressure, we know that exists, and the rankings between universities is all dependent on how much that we publish. You will see that in your lives as you progress within academia. So we didn't produce much middle range theory in these decades. So we are producing like grand theory about globalization, but not how these particular issues of particular countries or particular topics of informality, privatization, were something that we can create some theory. And also this idea of activism for academia was replaced by legitimacy. So how legitimate it is your voice in the public debate, how legitimate is your voice for public authorities, for politicians, and we are most of the time more worried about that, for being included by politicians, and not much worried about the grassroots organizations that suffer from most of the public policies that are produced. So there are some axes of current research that I could highlight here. Some guys are focused on the impact of globalization on urbanization patterns. Some others are focused on social restructuring of cities in terms of poverty and social polarization. And some others are focused on governance of cities in terms of local governments, the urban management, citizenship, democracy, participation, all the issues of the participatory budgets, for example, in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, it's a very important part of Latin American urban studies, or what they are doing in Colombia, for example, with social urbanism, urbanismo social, in which they invest a lot of infrastructure and with a lot of involvement with informal settlements, etc. So there are different issues that have been discussed in Latin America's academia in the last 20 years. So there is also transformation of research topics in terms of the availability and the technical capabilities to work with quantitative data, for example, particularly for issues like residential segregation. We had scholars talking about segregation in the 60s and 70s, but they were doing like grand theory, like, okay, I see a city which is kind of, it looks like very, very segregated, but they didn't have the data. Now we do have the data, and we have a lot of data in many places of Latin America. So we are improving that part of the technical part, the sophistication of methods on those studies, but that is creating more fragmentation of our construction, of our knowledge construction. But also the old topics continue to be relevant, like informal settlements. We're still studying informal settlements because they persist. They are still there. They are growing, actually. They are growing up. And some of them are densifying, like in Brazil and in Colombia. They are building more and more floors, or they are buying more land with mafias of land, narco drug dealing, urbanizators, or even real estate development of drug dealers, which is a big issue of urban development, of how do you control those type of urban development, which is not social movements, politicized social movements, but drug dealers doing real estate development in the peripheries, which is a big issue in Colombia, in Brazil, in Peru, and now even in Chile as well. So we have, we will say, 4 current research trends in terms of the homogenization of reality from capitalist globalization, how cities are becoming more and more similar in several parts of the world, even though we are in the global south and we are very different in different Latin American countries. Also the generalization from models of the global north. How can we generalize our knowledge, our problems, our issues here to have conversations with people in the global north? And how we have this global local analytical polarization, how we understand cities from satellites, from the outer space, and how we understand cities from the street level, right, from people. And also the whole issue of knowledge fragmentation, how social sciences in general and urban studies in particular have been fragmented in terms of a lot of different topics. Actually, one of the ways in which I try to systematize this fragmentation is that we have problems of urban development, problems of planning, problems of the city, of the configuration, the physical configuration of cities, you may say, and also problems that happen in cities, which are not problems of urban development, but are problems that are shaped by space, like urban social movements, or gay and lesbian movements, or problems of class, problems of gender. There are problems that happens. I mean, street harassment, for example, problems that happen in cities, but are not problems of the configuration, of the physical configuration of cities. So that poses a big question about what are urban studies. How can we talk about urban studies if we don't really know what part of it are really urban or just general social sciences? We also have like 3 types of biases in our research since the 1990s. There are some links between the global and the local without seeing the mechanisms that produce these local problems with global influences. Also, an increasing polarization and segregation, which is assumed due to globalization, but we don't really understand what are the mechanisms, again, that are producing more and more segregation and polarization. And a third problem is that this focus on globalization is concealing the existing city and the unexpected events. So, which we're very much concerned, for example, about these rankings of global cities, in which we put Sao Paulo at the top, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, the usual suspects of global Latin American cities, competing to London, San Francisco, New York, Tokyo, etc. But there are some, of course, some biases on that. So our Latin American research has moved from a failed modernity to a particular focus on the right to the city. And this is mostly joined with urban social movements, which I, of course, I like, because this is a link that we lost some decades ago, and it's becoming more stronger, at least for a group of scholars. So informality is assumed as a permanent landscape. We are not seeing cities that are being built from scratch as informal as it happened in the 50s and 60s. Now informality is part of our everyday reality. So research focuses on the entire city as a system. The studies of segregation appear, but without explaining the production and consumption and segregated urban form. As I said before, this is part of our biases. We are trying to research the subjective dimensions of poverty. This is part of also of the fragmentation of our knowledge production. Some people trying to look at the symbolic, some other try to look at the materialist part of poverty. And the idea of the right to the city is replacing the ideology of modernity. So we don't need to be following this path of going and progressing through and to modernity and to development from underdevelopment, but we are trying to think of how our rights in the city, our rights as human beings, can be shaped by a different type of development. And this is different from this 1950s, 1970s idea of development or underdevelopment. So this is no longer exclusion or marginalization, but it's the issue of deprivation of rights, right? And this is changing the focus of many research that is being done right now in the continent. So now I'm going to shift the focus to research that is being done in other continents, not much in Latin America. So if you have questions now about Latin America, this is the moment. I'm going to return to Latin America by the end of this part, but right now I want to talk about the Global South. That's part of the efforts that we have to make. Actually, when I teach my students, I would say that if you want to be a critical scholar in the Global South, you have to make 4 times the effort of a mainstream scholar in the Global North. A mainstream scholar in the Global North, they just study the Global North and just in terms of mainstream theories. A critical scholar in the Global North, they study mainstream theories in the Global North and critical theories in the Global North. So 2 times effort. And a critical scholar in the Global South, we have to study mainstream and critical theories in the Global North and mainstream and critical theories in the Global South. So 4 times the effort. So we have to read a lot to build this, to understand the position and location of all these theories. So sometimes it's too general, maybe. That's part of the problem, the risk of taking this path. But it's useful to know where you are located in the world in terms of theories and construction. I mean, I would say most of the scholars, but not all the scholars. Mainstream scholars will be spending their time trying to legitimate themselves in front of academia and in front of public officials and authorities and politicians, right? But not much scholars are involved with grassroots movements and grassroots leaders and the people, right? And that happened in the 60s and 70s. You had like many scholars in the peripheries working with them, right? Right now we are worried about our papers, and we're worried about the rankings between universities. That was my argument. I don't know if that's your question.
It was more.
Yeah. The colonization not only of knowledge, it's the colonization of the ways in which we produce knowledge. I mean, the knowledge of indigenous people, the way in which they produce knowledge is very different to this. They didn't have like university titles. That's a creation from us. They didn't have property titles. They don't believe in property titles. They just occupy the land. They don't need to have a parcel of land with a fence, right? So we have a Western way of teaching, a Western way of producing knowledge. And this is the thing that I'm going to comment right now, actually, about the post-colonial thing. So we have, of course, different rounds of waves of post-colonial, colonial influences, and different ways of labeling them. Some of them are neo-colonial or other type of international influence. Some other call it like theory transfer or policy mobility or policy transfer. There are many ways of thinking about that, but I'm going to show you this. This whole idea of post-colonialism started in the academic world, at least, in the 1950s after World War II. In which we had a lot of countries being decolonized from their former colonies. A lot of European colonies were set free in a process of decolonization. Although in Latin America, our decolonization started more than 100 years ago. So our own discussion about being decolonial or post-colonial was much older than that. But the large academic discussion about post-colonial framing started after World War II. And we had, of course, traveling of Latin American scholars to study their PhD in the US and in Europe. And they say, okay, we're learning from Eurocentric point of views. Why don't we create Latin American theories? And they came back to Latin America with some of the learnings that they got from Europe and the US, and they tried to create Latin American knowledge. So what is the more authentic or pure knowledge? I mean, we don't have a pure, absolutely 100% pure knowledge or pure Latin American or pure local knowledge. It is always a traveling of ideas, a mixture of ideas, and in ways, in the way you think that you produce your ideas. And of course, we can make some differentiations, but you won't have like a straight line of differentiation. Like this is local, this is authentic, this is purely Latin American, this is purely Global South. We don't even know what is Global South and what is not, actually. There is a brand line that separates something, but we don't really know. But we have some ideas, and we can start to connect those ideas here. So there are some post-colonial theorists about the Global South. This is the brand line, by the way, which separates the Rio Grande between the US and Mexico, and then the Mediterranean, and then China is below, even though China is now a big power in the world. So it's kind of confusing. But there is a rise of post-colonial urban theory in the Anglo-Saxon literature, and I will repeat that, in the Anglo-Saxon literature, that has been growing in the last 10 years, and it's becoming very powerful as an approach, and I respect it. I will criticize it afterward, but I respect it because it is very interesting the way they frame it. So they say that we need new theorizations for the Global South, because the cities in the Global South can no longer be studied by theories of the Global North. So where do we pick the theories with which we study our subjects of study? This is the big questions for you. Are you using foreign theories? Are you using local theories? Are you mixing both? Are you making the difference between this is the theory from the North, but I'm going to use it for this, this, and this, but mostly because we have these problems. So this is something that you have to use methodologically in the way you create knowledge and you start your research work. So we deserve greater consideration in terms of Global South cities. The center of urban theorization, they say, should be in the Global South. Why? Because we have much more cities, much more people. The large part of urbanization processes are happening in the Global South. People are moving by millions in Africa and in Asia to cities at this very moment. So it is important. So we need post-colonial urban theory. We need to think outside Eurocentric orientations, or at least a complement to that. And we have problems with concepts such as modernity and the linearity that they pose, like development. We need to development the way they want us to develop, right? So cities of the South are spaces, can be spaces for theoretical experimentation that can also illuminate the near future of the Global North. That's a big idea, and it's a very ambitious idea. Like, how can we understand, how can they understand in the North, in Europe, and the US, can they understand their own cities, seeing the problems of Global South cities? That's a big ambition. There are some examples of that. For example, Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, he went to an international convention, and he said to Europe that this is not a urban studies stuff, this is just economic stuff. He said to Europe, you are suffering right now from the financial crisis from 2010. This is something we had in the 1980s in Latin America. We had the crisis de la deuda, a debt crisis. It was huge in Latin America. It was horrible. We call it the debt decade. The whole decade was horrible. And he said that you're going to suffer the same that we suffered 3 decades ago. And something can be said in some of those terms about cities. Some cities of the Global South can illuminate problems that are being suffered in the Global North as well. So the South can provide, the Global South can provide different perspectives in terms of ideas and experiences from the South that are ignored in the hegemonic accounts of knowledge production. The facts and the ideas from the South are important to understand the world as a whole, not just the South itself. We don't need to think of the South of a special place. If you want to think the world of cities, like cities in all parts of the world, you need to take account of the South. The South has most of the cities, the South has most of the population, the South have the largest cities in the world. So it is important to have that. And this North-South axis of power, this is part of the post-colonial ideas, can be inverted in terms of challenging these hegemonies, in terms of provincializing knowledge, which means that you have this global North knowledge about London, for example. Okay, that happens in London. It doesn't need to happen in all cities of the world. If you're talking about the city, and I will show you a book that I have just here. Let me. This is called the Blackwell Companion. And you look at the camera. The Blackwell Companion to the city. What is the city? The city, it is one city? It is a European city, a US city, or they are supposing that all cities in the world should be like the city, right? I mean, I understand there are many ideas behind that, but the way that they pose the idea of the city is usually what we call the usual suspects. And what are the usual suspects of urban theory, of global North urban theory? It's London, because there are a lot of studies on London. It's Paris, sometimes it's Berlin, sometimes it's Barcelona, a lot of New York, a lot in Chicago, a lot in Los Angeles. But also there are silences about the rest of global North theories. So even that global North theory doesn't apply that well on the rest of the global North. So we need more cities to get into account, and we need also to abandon this idea of exceptionalism, of the global South being exception to the idea of development and modernization, right? What else? How can we define the global South? This is weird, it's strange, it's tricky, it's not conventional, it's confusing. This brand line, as I show you here, this blue line differentiation, it was a new way of dividing the world. Before that, we have the first world of capitalist world, the second world, which was the socialist world, and then the third world, we were the non-aligned countries. But now we have this binary division between global North and global South. So there is this brand line. It's a substitute for this separation between the first and the third world. And there is also a separation between the colonial centers and the post-colonial peripheries. If you want to talk about what is common to these very, very different countries and cities in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, most of us were colonists. Almost all of us were colonists in the past, colonists from the global North. So the mainstream study of global South urbanization could be either as a process linked to the context, how we understand the context in which these cities are happening, they are evolving, or as a dualistic example to present the global North. So usually we have a lot of scholars coming from the global North, coming to our countries to study and to compare this exception of global South cities, or to understand these cities as an exception, as a context-specific development that they can show and generalize to a general theory on the global north. And the same happens with the study of informality, right? Like they are supposed to not have informality in the global north, and they contrast that with the global south. What else? So these post-colonial theories, they criticize the idea of coloniality in Latin America, which is older actually than the current debate, but mostly from literature and cultural studies. We have had post-colonial theories in Latin America the whole 20th century, and these post-colonial urban studies just appear in the last 10 years, right? But the thing is, their main argument is the purpose of this global south theory lies in the goal is to destabilize the thought of the North and to prevent the idea of the North and to provincialize it. Like, this is the idea of London. Okay, keep it in London, but not spread it for the rest of the world. It's just London theory or Berlin theory or Paris theory, but it's not applicable to the rest of the world as easy as you think, and make the South more worldly. More worldly mean that it's more mundane. It could be normal. It's part of the world of cities. It's part of our entire global system. So this post-colonial critique, it has an interest in the Western discursive practices to produce knowledge. So how do they produce knowledge? And it's developmentalist, the idea of development, view of global South cities and Western cities as modernity. So they, in the global North, they are modernity. We are in the process of development. And they also focus on the need to see all cities as ordinary. They are all part of the world of cities. And they have a strong methodological commitment to comparativism, to internationalize urban theories. So comparing cities from the North to cities from the South, comparing cities within the South, like cities from Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, etc. So there are three key claims about this from these post-colonial theories. First, this parochial origin of theories of urban modernity, like they could be just a provincial way of producing something, but not a hegemonic idea for the rest of the world. There are also dangers of promulgating global cities as models of urbanization. We don't need to follow the same path as New York, London, and Tokyo. And there is also the idea, the need of comparative urbanity as a method for cosmopolitan theorization. If you want to understand cities, then take all cities into account, not just global North cities. And this language of developmentalism, of development, they call it the southern cities are backwards, as economically stagnant, as plagued with problems, that they require international assistance to modernize and to develop, like from the World Bank, the IMF, all these international agencies, with a persistent dualism. And they, from the global North, they do research on southern cities only to get information, but not to create theory from the South. So they are extracting the cases, even to pose, to refine their own knowledge. And we are starting to call that academic extractivism, which is a problem not only for the global North, it's a problem even for us as scholars. As I told you before, scholars are divided from popular classes, divided from grassroots organizations, are more worried about publishing, and these guys are not very happy with that division. And they are claiming this academic extractivism, even from their own country's scholars. And they don't want people just visiting their places, extracting information, and then leaving for publishing in other super special journals of knowledge. So one of the big theorists of post-colonial theory is Jennifer Robinson. She's from South Africa, but she works in London, in UCL. That's one of the ways that I'm gonna take afterwards. So she's proposing a comparative method to incentivize and to compare the most different cities between the global north and the global south, not the city as a unit of analysis, but the flow of connections. So the flow of neoliberalism, for example, the flow of international aid, the flow of different types of informality, etc. So she's trying to propose the connection between transnational relationships of dependency in a multi-scalar approach from everyday urbanity to macrostructures of power, trying to understand why these very specific informal settlements are related to global flows of capital, for example. And there is a lot of connections that we can make about that. Another key theory is Ananya Roy. She's from India, but she works at UCLA. Again, global north. So she's proposing the understanding of informality as part of the habitus. Habitus is Pierre Bourdieu's concept of how you deal with yourself, basically. So informality as the habitus that deregulate the state apparatus. But it's not outside the official protocols, but it is within, it's complementing, it's always dealing with what is formal, what is not formal, what is legal, what is illegal. So the governance of institution builds this representation of residents, sometimes against the social agency of the poor. So the places and contexts must be understood in global regimes of domination, with a connection between the local and the global, trying to understand how informality works, how informality deals with state, how informality deals with these global flows of capital around the world, etc. So I will end this presentation. I'm arriving to the end. I'm sorry I'm extending myself. Sometimes I just talk too much. With problems, with my own development of criticism to these post-colonial theories. Although I respect them, I admire them, they are great scholars, and I think there is a big contribution. There are a set of problems with their framing. So Alan Mavin is from South Africa, and he works in South Africa, actually. He doesn't work in Europe. He says, a lot of what is being written currently from the South ends up analyzing cities of the South through concepts and tools emanating from long-standing urban studies elsewhere. So we are being written by other guys that are placed up there in the north, that are structuring our knowledge. They are writing about the city, as I showed, right? And sometimes if you want to write about our own cities, we are also using the global north analytical tools, and that's part of the problem that I'm going to show you now. So we need to pay, we need this rebalancing of attention towards southern cities, of course, but that does not necessarily produce a change in thinking. We have more attention, of course, we have had more attention in the last 10, 15 years. People are more interested in the global south in general. I mean, people in the discipline of urban studies. But it's also important to recognize the location of knowledge production. Where is knowledge being produced? Is it in London? Is it in New York? Or is it in the global south, really? So these rhetorical representations are very powerful, even if they do not add much theory. So we can put the discourse of, okay, we need to shift the attention to the global south, but where is knowledge being produced still? In other parts of the world, or is it in the global south? So the problems also are that we only have a few observations with little ethnographic work. Ethnographic is the work that anthropologists used to do. They are involved in the streets, they are observing people, they are talking to people, not just looking from the satellite, from the outer space, but looking within those problems. The thing is that, again, we have our usual suspects. As I mentioned, urban theory from the north, they always talk about London, about Paris, Berlin, Barcelona, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. But we also have our usual suspects of the south: Johannesburg, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Buenos Aires. They are always referring to, okay, I have an example from the global south. Okay, now I have the world, right? But what happens with the rates of the city? I just have one example. It's just one city. You have thousands of cities in other parts. So in many cases, there are researchers that live, work, and come from northern cities, from the global north, but bring their exogenous concerns on inappropriate grounds, right? So they put their own methodologies, they put their own analytical framework to understand our problems. So there are a lot of international efforts for scholarships, for travel, for research, for projects, etc., that are funded from the global north. There's a lot of money involved in this, but they put the framing. Like they want to be framed from their own thinking, from their own understanding on how you have to understand the global north. Okay, now you have the money, now go and travel and do the research, right? So there is a lot of control on that. So these global south issues are mostly discussed from the north, and there is of course a big difference. There are, even though we have more population, the global north have more universities and have more scholars and have more PhDs and more journals and more publication, and whatever you want to count, there is more. And even in critical circuits, I usually go to the RC21 conference. I love that conference. It's the conference of critical scholars that was founded by the guys, the old guard or Marxists from the 60s and 70s. But it's still the place in which you will hear more about the global south in the north, in those conferences. The last conference was in Athens, in Greece, and I went there. So the global north, in many senses, sets the agenda and the discussion parameters, and all of that is in the English language. And we cannot escape from that. I learned that. I was disappointed of that, but at one point of time, I learned that in Asia, they speak English to each other. They don't have a lingua franca, like the Esperanto in Europe that they try to raise, right? In Latin America, we have Spanish or Portuñol, Portuguese and Espanol. But in Asia, they have to communicate in English, in a very, very far and foreign language. It is, they don't even have a Romance language. At least Spanish is a Romance language. It's kind of close to English. But in Asia, they have to communicate to each other in English between the different countries because their own languages are not compatible, right? So everything is in the English language in academia, mostly. And there is a big asymmetry in knowledge production. The knowledge from the south, from the global south, never reaches the north. The knowledge that is created in the global south, it is very difficult to reach the north. We have to make a big effort from Latin America to publish. I mean, we are forced from our universities to publish in global north journals, in high impact journals, Web of Science journals, but mostly because of this language gap also as well. So mainstream knowledge about cities is created by researchers from the north that are working in the south. They got their funding, they got their scholarships, they travel, they come here, but they are established in the north, as I was showing you, like people from South Africa, people from India that are established in universities of the north. So London. You imagine London. What is London? London was, and it still is, the city of the capital of the largest empire of human history, the British Empire. The capital of the largest empire of human history. Okay, colonization for them, the colonies ended. Sometimes this is kind of in the middle of it. But they have the tentacles. They have all this infrastructure, all the contacts, a lot of British people, British connection, British institutions working around the world as if colonialism was still alive. So everything passes through London. It's the capital of this largest empire. Almost everything passes through London before moving to other places. And I'm talking here about people, data, and research. If you want to do something between the global south, between Africa and Latin America, who you will call to do that? Somebody in London, because that guy in London will know people from both places, right? So they are the axis, and I'm emphasizing that. Maybe there are many other points of connections in Europe and in the United States, but London is, at least for urban studies, is the center of those south-south connections. You can answer that in many ways. Nationalism does exist, of course, but also we can say in Latin America, we can mention Latin Americanism or Latin Americanisms, very different ways of identification as a continent, because we are united by colonialism, we are united by language, we are united by indigenous heritage, but still, even though we have more similarities than countries in Europe, among them, we haven't had a central Latin American bank. We don't have like a Latin American union. We can't travel freely or work freely as Europeans can do in different countries. We don't have that, right? Because, as you mentioned, of nationalism. And that's a big problem of differences of institutionalism, differences of development between different countries, political problems like dictatorships happening in different countries. So it is a dream maybe for the future. Some people have been posing that idea, but it's gonna take long to conquer that idea. But also, what has been discussed from the beginning, from this critical discussion, it's what we call internal colonialism. It's not, we actually, in Latin America, the history of Latin America is that our independences were in the 1800s, were done by elites, by white elites of Spanish people who were Latin American at that time, who wanted to be independent from Spain and Portugal, But just that little change, that didn't mean that they want to include the indigenous or the mixed race people. The only people that could vote actually was people with land, males with land, property owners, right? So those are that's a big problem, because we have very small elites that are very rich in Latin America, that pose most of our barriers for building ideas of country, of continents, of all of that. So we have layers and layers of complexity in terms of maybe nationalism, internationalism, Latin Americanism, but also the issue of our own internal elites continuing the job of internal colonialism. But very welcome, good comment, right? So going back to this post-colonial, the problems of post-colonial thinking, as I mentioned, the best scholars from the South are co-opted by the North, or maybe if I say it less pejoratively, they are hired by big universities. So Jennifer Robinson from South Africa to UCL, Ananya Roy from India to UCLA, Asef Bayat working in the US, Aníbal Quijano, Peruvian, working in the US, Susan Parnell from South Africa working in Manchester. So there is a centralization of production due to the hegemonic role of English, of the English language. And actually, in this class, we are talking English, even though we are from countries that doesn't have English as the first language, right? But there is, within these layers of complexity, you have the advantage of Indians and South Africans and other former British colonies, that they have a partial Anglo-Saxon culture in some sense, and they have a very, very close connection with London. They have people living in London, they have British people still working in those countries, right? So while at the same time, the Spanish Portuguese countries and that knowledge production barely exists, right? We have our journals in Spanish and in Portuguese, but they don't read it up north. So we have to publish on our own journals, and we have to publish in their journals to be heard. Because if we don't publish that, they are going to publish about us. And I have had the problem, for example, we have had people from Mozambique coming to study at our institute. And I was saying to her, to my thesis student, well, try to look at your local library, the best library of your country, to look at information. She was not finding anything, but she started looking at international agencies and global north universities, and it was mountains and mountains of data and information and knowledge about her own country. So her country doesn't have any information, any knowledge in their own libraries, in their own universities. All of the knowledge about them, about an African country, Mozambique, was in other parts of the world, was in the global north. So that was kind of depressing. Effects on colonialism, it is interesting to understand that this is in the common sense of colonized countries, whether with wars or actions that reinforce Eurocentrism. Of course, that's part of what we're discussing with Ideally as well, right? Like we grew up with this colonial thinking. We grew up with Eurocentric historical legacy. We still kind of celebrate the arrival of Christopher Columbus to Latin America in the 12th of October. So it's still a topic, but it's becoming more and more questioned every year. There is, for example, the Latin American Studies Association, the LASA, in which there is the majority of the members of that association are English speakers from the global north. Most of the conferences of that association are held in Europe or in North America, and they define the research agenda, although this is starting to change. Some of the conferences are being held in Latin America. There are many barriers for South-South connections in terms of communication, networks, organizations, etc. And there are almost no direct connections between Latin America and Africa, Asia, the Arab world. So our knowledge and our history was, and it still is, centered on Europe. So again, everything passes through London, as I said. I did this exercise with our own journal, our Journal of Urban Studies. We have it at our institute. It's a Web of Science journal, just to show the language gap in urban studies. So I put the 116 keywords that we have from our journal in our thesaurus in Google Scholar, and on average, 11.2. I got 11.2 more results in Google Scholar in English for the same term in English than in Spanish. And here I'm showing just the top of them. So traffic management versus gestión del tráfico, the same concept, was 193 times more results in English than in Spanish. So that's a big, huge gap in terms of knowledge production. And finally, just to emphasize on how can we connect these are travel lines, flight carriers. Like, how can we just travel from Latin America to Asia, from Latin America to Africa and the Arab world, if we don't even have travel connections or flights going from somewhere? There are a few flights that go from Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo to Johannesburg, or Buenos Aires to Johannesburg, that from Santiago, for example. And we cannot travel to China, for example. Even we have to go to Los Angeles and then travel to there, right? So we are disconnected. We are far from each other. We should learn from each other, but we know very few about each other. And again, everything passes through the colonial centers in the global north. And that's more or less what I have. I would love to have more questions and comments. I mean, there are some efforts for building networks, like South-South networks, there are people, I mean, I won't be that critical because there are very, very good people working from London, Latin American working from London, Arab people working from London, Asian, African people working from London, who does a very good job. And they help us sometimes build our own networks, South-South networks. So there are efforts on that. And so, as you mentioned, colonialism is not just an economic endeavor. It works in many, many different ways, and knowledge production is part of it. Communication, language, part of it. As we move from one country to another, and how knowledge stays in one part and moves to other parts. So it's difficult to understand how can we turn this into a different situation. How can we transform this into other type of relationship between each other and build our own knowledge? It's a challenge, of course, and we have to think about that. But there are some networks trying to be built. In Latin America, we have a lot of networks. The thing is that we don't reach the other parts of the global south. That's our challenge. I should see other challenges in Africa, have communicated with people in Africa, and there are some guys that try to connect between the different points.